I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Inez Stepman.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common sense and common good meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Make sure to subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. We're going to start today by talking about the Biden administration fighting so desperately to be able to gatekeep speech, to police our speech. Ben is going to explain what's happening, new developments in that sphere, although it feels like there's a new one every week. They just continue to crack down on American speech in fun ways. Josh is then going to take over and talk to us about the debate over Ukraine and NATO. There's a NATO Summit happening this week, as you certainly noticed on the news cycle. And Zelensky has plenty to say, as does the American side and people like Antony Blinken. Then Inez is going to talk to us about a Casey DeSantis ad and the parents' vote in 2024. I'll finish by talking about the controversy that unfolded this week after Maureen Dowd, of all people, wrote a column criticizing Joe Biden for not acknowledging his seventh grandchild. The View went crazy, and I think it's worth sort of diving into all of that. So let's start with the free speech policing, and you, Ben.
Thanks. And I guess there's more good tidings to be had with respect to this bombshell landmark, true bombshell, not even scare quotes here, bombshell, and really, frankly, historic case, Missouri v. Biden, which has blown the lid off the story of federal government-led speech policing in cahoots with putatively private sector cutouts, so-called academic and research anti-disinfo organizations working with the social media companies to get them to suppress all manner of wrongthink. And as we discussed last week in an amazing July 4th injunction, the judge presiding over that case, Judge Terry Doty, issued a temporary injunction freezing the federal government-led aspect of this mass public-private censorship regime that's hoovered up literally billions of pieces of content and probably gotten hundreds of millions of pieces of content at least censored or never even drafted, thanks to the policies put in place. As we discussed, and I think as might have been indicated already at the time, it was very clear that the feds would be appealing this injunction. And in fact, they also sought a stay of the injunction, that is to freeze the freeze on federal government-led speech policing. Ultimately, both the plaintiffs attacked that motion, and then very quickly thereafter, Judge Doty himself shot down the stay. Nevertheless, the appeal has occurred. There is a document out there, an appeal to the Fifth Circuit. We'll see where that goes. But I want to focus on the government's arguments calling for a stay, for a freeze of this freeze of their speech policing, because I think it's so revealing about the worldview governing the entirety of the U.S. government right now when it comes to our speech. And I'll just read very briefly from the intro to this short motion for a stay. Here's what the government's argument was for maintaining their speech policing regime. The government faces irreparable harm with each day the injunction remains in effect, as the injunction's broad scope and ambiguous terms, debatable by the way, including a lack of clarity with respect to what the injunction does not prohibit, also not even debatable because it lays out, incidentally, many areas where government agencies can continue to talk to social media companies dealing with national security or criminal acts, for example. Anyway, the injunction may be read to prevent the government from engaging in a vast range of lawful and responsible conduct, including speaking on matters of public concern and working with social media companies on initiatives to prevent grave harm to the American people and our democratic processes. And that sort of argument carried over into the federal government's appeal. But I think it's remarkable to state very clearly what the feds are saying here. What they are saying is twofold. First of all, your right to speak freely causes irreparable harm to the federal government. Or when you look at the conduct they actually engaged in with the censoring of the Hunter Biden laptop story, for example, election interference, preventing government-led election interference causes irreparable harm to the federal government. This is the perspective that they're taking. And they put this, of course, under the sort of argument of your speech equals harm and the government needs to remove that harm by silencing you. But beyond that, then they also have this asinine argument about somehow you're taking away the government's First Amendment right to speak by preventing the government from censoring you, by preventing government agencies from going to social media companies and flagging for them all manner of tweets and Facebook posts or entire narratives, or telling those companies, gee, you better change your terms of service to block en masse offending content according to the views and the whims of the government agencies or the Biden administration. And what they're saying is, you're taking away our right to speak, our right being the government's right to speak. And what's, obviously asinine about this, beyond, of course, the fact that the injunction was very detailed in going through the various categories of conduct the government can engage in its communications with social media companies, is that it's not as if there's anything in the injunction saying, well, government officials can't issue press releases or call for press conferences or use their social media accounts, et cetera, et cetera. This is purely about preventing government-led speech policing, but the government can't tolerate that. And so that's why I think that this failed stay that the government put forth is so significant, because it so perfectly captures the anti-freedom worldview, essentially, of our government, but also the government's desire, its utter contempt for the First Amendment, and its desire and almost necessity to silence those who dissent. And, that's obviously reflected in the findings, the evidence produced that's been remarkable in this case. But the fact that the government so straightforward and brazenly says, you're going to cause us harm by preventing us from violating your right to free speech, I think it's remarkable, and it's worth emphasizing that this is the perspective of our betters. So this is a pivotal case. We'll see where the appeal goes. Ultimately, this case may end up in some form or fashion being litigated and brought before the Supreme Court. We ought to watch it. And last but not least, so just note briefly, and I did a super thread on this last night, the House Weaponization Committee is out with a report basically showing that the FBI passed along censorship requests from a Ukrainian intelligence agency that was wholly compromised and overrun by pro-Russian forces, and actually got social media companies to try and censor people, including Americans, and including even a State Department Russian language account through these requests to social media companies. So this effort has continued this censorship regime, and that's precisely why there has to be an injunction on it. And with that, put it out to the group for your takeaways on where this case is and where it's going.
And I'll just quickly add to I'm going to be really quick and say, I think it's important not to lose sight of, not that anybody here is doing it, but as Ben was talking, one thing that just strikes me is how time and again what they're censoring is turning out to be true information. And so when you're looking at what they wanted to censor, in this case, COVID information, Hunter Biden laptop stories, information about Ukraine, there are all, legitimate arguments for genuinely harmful information that could be circulating around the public that you can perceivably make, et cetera, that, maybe I don't really think the government should have a role in it, but you can maybe make the argument that it's toxic and has a public health risk attached to it or something like that. You can maybe make that argument sometimes. In these cases, and it seems like in so many of these high-profile stories, they're actually turning out to be censoring true information. Lab leak is another really good example if you look at what Fauci and Collins were emailing back and forth to each other. So time and again, what we're finding is like this argument is a smokescreen when it comes to like actual public health risks or international security risks, whatever. And what they end up doing is cheapening real concerns about those to the extent that they should exist down the road. It's the same thing with Russian collusion. Like, yeah, Russia did try to interfere in the election with some stupid memes, not by compromising the Republican candidate. So I'll turn it over on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously what this case is making clear is that this kind of communication is basically an end run around the First Amendment and democracy, both, right? Emily just pointed to the fact that a lot of the stuff that's censored, it turns out to be true, and everyone admits that it's true several months later. But at the same time, like at the moment, you even have some of these social media platforms pulling down video of elected officials questioning under oath people who are appearing before them in Congress and hearings, right? That makes it impossible for a democracy to function if we can't even observe what our elected officials are even doing unless we happen to be sitting in Congress at that given moment, right? Look, I guess this highlights two more points that I wanted to make. One is the nature of our ruling class is segregated by public and private means, right? These are people who largely agree with each other. Unfortunately, a lot of the takeaways that I believe will be sort of drawn out from some of these positive cases is basically just never write anything down. Right. A lot of these people, they work in the same environments. They move in and out of government, academia, and the private sector, all in this kind of little triangle that goes back and forth. We hear a lot about the revolving door when it comes to lobbyists and elected officials. There is a revolving door to what Ike called, right, the sort of scientific industrial complex, right? And so what's going on here are a lot of the same people who went to the same schools. They did some, they've done other kinds of programs together. A lot of them know each other as colleagues over time in the same fields. This is not like a separable beast. Largely speaking, and maybe that goes to the fact that our elite is way too homogenized in a way that even if you go back 50 or 100 years, it really wasn't. Not in all the ways the left wants to believe, of course, about race and everything else, but for example, regionally, where you had like industrialists from one part of the country and land barons from another, and you kind of had different types of elites in different spheres. And now all of our elites are extremely homogenized, coming up through the same system, all designed to produce the ultimate in what America of 2022 23 considers elite, which is Pete Buttigieg, more or less, right? And then finally, just a really, really brief point. There's a question of what's going to happen when we do have these positive rulings, right? There's going to be a campaign of to delegitimize the court. We saw what happened when the deep state writ large decided the people are not allowed to elect Donald Trump. I don't see what's going to prevent the same thing from happening, just basically saying, no, the courts are not allowed to stop what we want to do either. So I think that really is the big question going forward. These are really positive rulings. I'm really happy to see them happen. They need to happen, but we need to be on guard for what I think is an inevitable pushback from basically the forces of permanent government in this country.
So we're basically out of time. So I'll just briefly add one kind of appendix note to this from a slightly more legal perspective. First of all, just at a non-legal perspective, I'm very happy that we're talking about this because it is extremely important to see in broad daylight the Biden administration's genuinely terrifying, and this word gets overused, but Judge Doty used it in his PI ruling, a genuinely Orwellian stance that the government is taking here. So basically, the legal threshold for a stay of a PI is you basically have to show kind of irreparable harm. So the fact that they're kind of using that language is not necessarily shocking because that is kind of the explicit legal standard, but it's still terrifying. I mean, it's not necessarily shocking from a black letter law perspective, but it literally like raises the hairs, the cackles, I think, like on the back of our necks when we see this kind of rhetoric from the Biden administration. The only final thing that I want to add here, real brief, Philip Hamburger, who has been extremely involved in this litigation, as he has been involved in many other kind of big tech censorship type litigations. He's represented various individual plaintiffs in a kind of a sister lawsuit of sorts, because this is primarily kind of a Missouri and Louisiana attorneys general lawsuit, but there's kind of a sister thing that Hamburger's firm, the New Civil Liberties Alliance, has been involved with. So he's had multiple Wall Street Journal pieces on this over the past month or so. And I just want to flag that he had a legal argument in the Journal about a month ago that I kind of only recently read or reread. I can't quite remember. And I found it just extremely compelling, which is this notion that, the basic defense here from the Biden administration and frankly from Facebook, Google, and the big tech oligarchs is what Inez was alluding to, that there is kind of this still remains this pivotal, indispensable distinction between the public sector and the private sector, and that the big tech actors are not truly state actors. They are not public. The point that Philip Hamburger makes is that that's actually the wrong way to think about the First Amendment free speech text, which very clearly speaks of abridging free speech. It makes no notion of the government has to kind of wholly control a purportedly private apparatus. Rather, if the government uses its myriad tentacles to suppress or abridge free speech. That is the violation. So anyway, sorry, we're way out of time in the segment, so we're going to transition here. But I just think that that's an extremely important First Amendment point to make, and I hope that we get some clarity on that point, whether it's at the Fifth Circuit or at the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay, so I'll transition now to myself. This is a fairly hard transition. Not going to try to sugarcoat this one. But in totally unrelated news, Joe Biden has been over in Lithuania this week for the NATO Summit. And kind of the topic of the day, or the topic of the summit, has been, what else, of course, especially in that part of the world. It's the lingering war, this horrible war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, it's gone on for almost a year and a half now. And specifically the question that is being frequently asked and debated, and there was kind of a buildup trying to figure out what exactly would be the Biden administration's stance when it comes to this particular question, is what would the U.S. stance be when it comes to Ukraine's prospective membership in NATO? And this is kind of an emotional issue for all parties involved, obviously. I mean, I don't pretend that this is kind of like a staid, sober issue. This is not kind of like a fine kind of debating marginal tax rates or capital gains tax rates kind of issue. From the Ukrainians obviously believe that if they were in NATO, then this invasion never would have happened. Zelensky, correctly, from a Ukrainian nationalist perspective, obviously wants to be a part of NATO, desperately wants NATO to be more formally and explicitly involved in this conflict. From his perspective, that's the easiest way to end it. And many of the other NATO members in Eastern Europe, countries like Lithuania itself, Poland, and some others, I think would be extremely sympathetic and warm to Ukrainian membership in NATO. However, because the four of us are Americans here, and this is NatCon squad, and we're supposed to be kind of skeptical of kind of the expansion of transnational institutions and sweeping kind of 30 to 40 country international alliances here, I think it's worth kind of briefly returning to something remotely resembling first principles when it comes to this question here. And it's important to bear in mind that NATO, which is already at roughly 31 or 32 countries, depending on, how soon Sweden will join. Turkey has just kind of greenlit Sweden's ascension. They were having kind of an inside baseball dispute over Sweden's treatment of the Kurds, which Turkey hates. It's not really worth getting into that right now. Finland has just ascended last year. So the question then is what the U.S. stance should be with Ukraine. And I'm actually pleasantly surprised, frankly, at what the Biden administration has actually said publicly thus far on this question, which is that they do not support it at this current time. Now, they're basically kicking the can down the road. They are leaving it open for U.S. support for Ukrainian membership at a hypothetical future date, but they're pretty firmly ruling it out at this time. Now, it's worth noting that there are some folks in both political parties who oppose Joe Biden on this. So, the most stereotypical of all the neoconservatives, folks like Lindsey Graham, are out there kind of gun charging. That's the same Lindsey Graham who was recently over in Kiev referring to the hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer money being spent in this conflict as kind of the best use of U.S. taxpayer money ever spent there. Folks like that are kind of clamoring or chomping at the bit for the U.S. to greenlight Ukrainian membership into NATO right now. I mean, it is worth, I think, at least briefly noting that the West's kind of constant dangling of possible Ukrainian membership for NATO in the first place is one reason why we are in this mess in the first place. I'm not saying it's the primary reason, but I absolutely do think that it is one reason, going back, at least kind of 5, 10, 15, perhaps years then. But the broader point is that the United States continues to foot the bill, primarily speaking, for NATO alliances and alliances like that. Under Article 5 of NATO, an attack on one is an attack on all. And the notion here that we should be expanding the U.S.'s responsibility to protect all of these effective satellite states, whether it's in NATO or frankly, whether it's in many other parts of the world, I think is just to kind of use kind of the overwrought phrase, just a total fundamental failure to understand what time it is. And it's a double failure to understand what time it is when you consider the fact that China is frankly the United States' first, second, third, fourth, and fifth biggest rival on the geopolitical stage right now. So to kind of just further our involvement and to kind of set us up for kind of future Article 5 treaty required obligations elsewhere strikes me as utter complete fallacy. But again, I'm cautiously optimistic that the Biden administration has not done the full Lindsey Graham on this one either. So I'm happy to kind of toss it open on that note.
Yeah, just a couple notes. One, Zelensky seems to be following the Biden administration line, which is as sort of the junior partner in this, that we're going to talk about this after the war. Because there were some pushes to have them join while they're still engaged in the war, and so that seems to be off the table. Biden took it off the table, and Zelensky now is following him in doing that. I've said here in the past, I think this entire narrative about NATO is somewhat of a misunderstanding of how Russians see the West and how Westerners see Russia and how we understand each other. But there's some very important points, I think, for both the war and for us and our national interest involved here. One, this is turning into something that looks a lot like World War One, fortunately without so far all the entrants from around the world, but where you have these sort of meat grinder mile by mile war of pushing the lines by very small amounts without having air support or air control, right? It's like very, because Russians have air dominance, it's extremely hard to do this advancement in the way that I think Ukrainians had hoped they would be able to do. And instead, what it's turning into is both enormous meat grinder for human life on both sides, but also an enormous waste of ammunition. And so that's what we're seeing. And the final point I would make, just in our interest, it should be, regardless of how anyone feels about our involvement in Ukraine, whatever, this should terrify every American. Biden, in talking about granting Ukraine cluster munitions, right, said basically we are out of other ammo and we can't produce more. That's a problem. Now, the administration has walked it back, and I know Biden sometimes goes off script and says things, and maybe he doesn't know what he's talking about. I wouldn't be the first time, right? But if it is true that the United States cannot even keep up with the munitions requirements for this war between Ukraine and Russia, we are in massive trouble. And this goes back to, an article that I highlighted, I think, on this podcast a long time ago, months ago, from Addison Del Maestro, actually in the Bulwark, the only good article I've ever read in the Bulwark thus far. But basically saying why the U.S. can no longer manufacture tiny little star-shaped pasta, and going back through like how there's an entire chain of manufacturing and expertise that is required, even for something relatively simple. Well, think about the military version of that. We need to think very seriously about whether the U.S. industrial base needs to be revived, not just for economic reasons or for all the reasons that, Donald Trump likes to talk about in terms of the forgotten American man and worker and decline in the Rust Belt, but whether our very national security desperately depends on the ability to actually manufacture the kind of ammunition that would actually carry us, not just in a war that for us is relatively minor, not for the Ukrainians, but for us should be relatively minor, this war between Ukraine and Russia, but also against a potential war with China, with our primary geopolitical foe. This is like very scary stuff.
Yeah, just to echo that point really briefly, under the Trump administration, there was a report put out on the defense industrial base showing, I think, multiple hundred gaps in our supply chains, vulnerabilities where we're reliant on other countries, including, by the way, communist China, to be able to produce significant military hardware. And meanwhile, we are running down our stockpiles in connection with Ukraine. So once again, you see this ultimately being an inadvertent benefit for communist China. I do wonder what these negotiations what these meetings regarding NATO today augur with respect to whatever kind of ultimate settlement will be reached between Russia and Ukraine. I'm not sure what the tea leaves show based upon the rhetoric that we've seen out of the parties in recent days, but I guess that's something that's TBD. And I think, to Josh's broader point, there are some basic questions about what should be the purpose of NATO, who is the greatest adversary that the West faces, and how should Western powers be oriented and prioritizing with respect to those threats? And obviously, communist China is the number one threat. I think for a while, we would have said that, I guess we would have downgraded Russia relative to where it is now, given Russia's aggression in, of course, recent years. But nevertheless, they are not even close to peer competitors. Russia has the trump card of the massive nuclear weapons stockpile, but outside of that, it's not nearly comparable to communist China. And so there becomes a question at the end of the day also, the notion of an attack on one is an attack on all. Would that actually hold up under duress, I think, is an open question. And then more importantly, what should the Western alliances and partnerships actually look like, given the prioritization of threats that we face throughout the world? And those will be interesting questions for Republicans to address going into 2024, I think, as well. And I'm sure we'll be covering that in the months ahead.
A lot of interesting questions raised by all of that. I would just add this entire NATO summit, and I think the attitude that Vladimir Zelensky has used towards the United States, it is just like deeply irritating, and we've set ourselves up for this now. Understandable, but deeply irritating at the same time. Given how poorly we've been able to track the use of our equipment and our spending over there, and how serious the threat of China is, not just to the United States, also to our other allies. When they suddenly have, chips problems because there's an invasion of Taiwan, they're going to want a whole lot from us then too. So there's just, this entire situation has been obviously frustrating to everyone for over a year now. But the level of death and destruction and the sort of disappointment of this spring turned summer offensive, I think is changing some minds in a positive direction. So on that note, I'll send it back to you, Inez.
Sure. And again, like Josh, I'm not going to attempt to, we're just going to hard reset here into the domestic 2024 space. The DeSantis campaign put out an ad with his wife, Casey DeSantis, very clearly targeted directly at parents, particularly moms, but at parents and with all the concerns, cultural concerns surrounding education, and the kind of ideological and physical threats that are coming at children from all directions in the current system, not only from the education system, but from their pediatricians, from book fairs, from libraries, right? It's just every institution has bought into whether it's a general sort of woke perspective or whether it's specifically gender ideology, pronouns, introducing children at very young ages to these kinds of things. In any case, I think, unlike some of the previous ads that got a lot of criticism for being too online from the DeSantis campaign, I think this is very much not. And I'm disappointed to see people honestly lumping this in with the rest of it. This is not really a concern of mine vis-a-vis the 2024 campaign itself, but how this fight between DeSantis and Trump is going to shape what becomes the agenda of the Republican Party. The Republican Party still has this enormous opportunity to really seize on parent energy. It is not fading. Look, overall, there is a kind of life cycle coming from my Tea Party days of popular movements, particularly popular movements that don't have a strong central leadership, right? This is genuinely organic in that way. It is bottom up. And for that reason, it's going to be very disjointed. There's not going to be one strong sort of agenda and marching orders. But I think right now, it's at the peak of its power, actually. And you can see that parent vote is still really commanding an enormous importance, not just in the primary race, but I think it will in the general as well. And you can see that by both the draw of the Moms for Liberty conference over the 4th of July weekend, the fact that they could this is one of the few places that managed to get Trump and DeSantis in the same venue, right? They've been kind of avoiding each other, but they both had to show up and make their case to Moms for Liberty. I think that's a really, really positive sign in terms of parent power, in terms of the importance of the parent vote and a lot of these cultural issues surrounding children and education in this race going forward. I think that is a testament to the fact that this movement is extremely powerful and that politicians are going to have to take note of it, whether you're DeSantis or Trump, or frankly, whether you're Joe Biden. So with that, I'll kick it out to you guys.
Well, and I think that's an important distinction in that there's a way to talk about issues for parents that is sort of makes sense on a grassroots in the parade type of conversation, right? It's very different if you're talking about if you're trying to rally people online to change a narrative so that reporters see a different kind of framing, right? With don't say gay. That's how a lot of very online, as we say pejoratively, but it is sometimes genuinely helpful for a campaign to have this it didn't really work for Kamala Harris. And we didn't see the sort of Twitter thing work for people like Michael Schellenberger, who's great either. But sometimes it really does penetrate the news cycle. And so when you have some online warriors chipping away, doing that day in and day out, that can be really helpful. It is very different than taking your message to parents. And it's very different than talking to people like on the streets of Florida or Iowa or New Hampshire. And I think just recognizing that is half the battle, and then not allowing the sort of, when they had Patrick Bateman in that one ad that they reposted, but they didn't create, and they're like splicing Ron DeSantis together with Patrick Bateman, which is only something you get if you're like really irony poisoned. You're like, oh, so this like American Psycho mass serial killer guy. That's cool. If unless you're like thoroughly irony poisoned, you might be very confused by that. But just making sure, that you understand you have to talk to people differently, and then being sure that messaging hits the right people and is not drowned out by mockery or whatever. This is one huge advantage that Donald Trump has, because he is so like he sets his own narrative. He cuts through everything else because he's a freaking reality TV show host and and that's much different for any other candidate. And so it's an uphill battle for DeSantis in a way it isn't for Trump. For Trump, he just needs to learn to talk about it, and to talk about it in a way that's like accurate and catches parents' attention and makes them feel like things will seriously be done. That's the DeSantis advantage. He's actually seriously taken steps, despite media nonsense and despite leftist nonsense. He's taken like real policy steps to addressing this in Florida and has like done stuff. So they both have different advantages here, but I think the messaging question is really, really important.
So look, I don't have like a compelling hot take or anything like that. I will merely say that from my vantage point as kind of the token Floridian of this group, and the token Floridian who, moved here due in no small part due to Governor DeSantis's policies and his leadership during COVID-19 above all else, and really just various other ways that he has transformed the nation's third largest state into kind of, in many ways, kind of the model of what red state governance and red state policies should look like. The whole kind of parental rights revolution has been arguably, after COVID-19, it has arguably been kind of the bread and butter, frankly, of all that DeSantis has tried to do here in Florida. I mean, that is an issue that he has run on repeatedly. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, this whole kind of Casey DeSantis-led Mamas for DeSantis thing, I think they used the exact same term, Mamas for DeSantis, for his gubernatorial reelect last year, if I'm not mistaken, actually. And, Moms for Liberty, which has only fairly recently gained national attention. That is a Florida-based group. I think they started in Sarasota, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember exactly where, maybe on the East Coast of Florida. I can't remember exactly where, but it's definitely kind of started down here in Florida. And look, I mean, from a broader perspective, this should go without saying, but just to kind of drive the point home, if Republicans actually are going to be kind of like the working and middle class party, if they actually are going to adopt a political economy that works for the working family and whatnot, a broader policy agenda oriented around making families viable, ideally on a single income, of course, easier said than done. And frankly, just empowering parents and families at all costs at the expense of outside hostile forces that would degrade the institutional integrity and indeed kind of the individual vitality of the members of that family. I mean, that's like as low-hanging fruit as it gets or at least as low-hanging fruit as it should get from a Republican perspective here. Now, obviously, just a very quick note, the polls thus far clearly show President Trump dominating this race on a national level. So, whatever tweaks the DeSantis campaign probably has in store over the coming months, whether it's kind of rhetoric, messaging, venues, things of that nature, that's all, fine. And we can kind of cross that bridge when we get to it. But the focus on parental rights is a very, very good one. And I certainly do not expect that to deviate from being kind of right in the crosshairs of what this campaign seeks to do.
Well, and it's worth noting, empowering families and parents strikes at the very heart of the left's agenda since time immemorial, which is to break up the family, demoralize the nation, infiltrate and pervert, faith, traditional faith, the church typically. So obviously, it's interesting to me. I think there's an open question of, is the left's pursuit of kids now that's so brazen and in your face illustrative of the fact that the Long March is about reaching its apex, or is it a desperation drive? Is it Overton window shifting? But clearly, I think all of the radicalism and targeting of kids ultimately is about beyond trying to get people to deny their very nature, creating a wedge between parents and their children, which is essential in any kind of revolution and takeover. And so the empowerment of parents and families and the fact that parents are awake now in a way they haven't been before potentially poses a massive threat, obviously, to the left. And it'll be interesting to see if over the next year and a half, the radicalism continues or the left backs off, knowing that it might imperil critical cohorts for them in quote unquote purple districts. And then I also wonder for parents in those purple districts who actually are aware of what's going on in their kids' schools, what do they weigh more? The efforts to indoctrinate their children, drive a wedge between children and their parents, demoralize them, inculcate them in a system that's totally antithetical to our system, etc., confuse them about their very basic inborn nature. Does that outweigh the fear-mongering of, obviously the ultra-right Christian zealot white nationalists who want people who get raped not to be able to have abortions? And that's obviously going to be the fear-mongering of the left on top of, the domestic violent extremists on the right, et cetera. And I'll be curious to see and interested to see which side wins out. Those who actually want to defend families and children, or those who engage in the hysterical fear-mongering that we've been witnessing now for, frankly, almost a decade.
All right, I'm actually going to be a little bit braver and bolder than the rest of you and build a bridge from this block to the next, because one final thought that I had as you all were discussing this is Ben just mentioned, parents who actually know what's going on in their kids' classrooms. And it reminds me of the hedge fund manager that said, I was going to support Ron DeSantis until I heard all about this book ban stuff. And so obviously a lot of this is just simply that people are not going to have the best information. They're not going to have accurate information. And one story that I think is egregiously underappreciated and undercovered by the media, but also just in the sort of broader public conversation, because the media has turned a blind eye to it, and the Democratic Party has allowed Joe Biden to ignore it, is the fact that he has 7 grandchildren. He makes his status as a grandfather central to his pitch to the American people. And he acknowledges only 6 of those grandchildren. Now, this is in the news again because elite scribe Maureen Dowd, of all people, picked up on it and wrote a very buzzy column published on Sunday about how it's, scarring was the word she uses to Joe Biden's 7th grandchild that the president refuses to acknowledge her as his grandchild. White House aides are reportedly instructed to refer to Joe Biden's 6 grandchildren, not 7. The 7th grandchild is unacknowledged. She goes unacknowledged. London Joan Roberts is her name. She's about 4 years old now. She goes unacknowledged because she was born of Hunter Biden's relationship with a stripper. And that is a just disgusting reason for a purported man of Christian faith to leave a grandchild behind and leave them out. I remember over Christmas, he had stockings hung in the White House for every grandchild, but not for every grandchild, because there was not one for Navy. I think her name is Navy Joan Roberts, and the mother's name is London Roberts, the former stripper that Hunter had a relationship with. And, they've been fighting over child support. They've been fighting over whether the kid is allowed to use the name. And The View discussed the controversy in just a grotesque manner this week, blaming Republicans for making it an issue, saying it's disgusting for Republicans, who obviously include Maureen Dowd, famous Republican Maureen Dowd, making an issue of the child, blah, blah, blah. Well, Biden makes an issue, of course, of himself as a grandfather and as a good Catholic man. He's made character front and center in his campaign. You can certainly contrast that with other candidates and people who don't make character central to their pitch to the American people. But Joe Biden definitely has. He said he'll restore normalcy and decency and civility. I think this is actually is it the most serious thing happening in the country right now? No. I do, though, think the fact that he gets away with this and that you have these rabid defenses of him in The View. Blind partisan loyalty is nothing new to the United States. But again, the fact that you have the chorus of women on The View, the fact that the media has turned a blind eye to this over and over again, I think says something really sad about how far standards have fallen in our country. And I don't mean for presidents. I mean just for like general, it's absolutely true that if this was happening with Trump, we know the left would be freaking out about it every single day. They would be on, baby watch outside the home, blah, 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 day in and day out. But the point is, it's just something like in our culture, I think, that is so hostile to family and or is so uncaring and nonchalant about family that Biden will sell himself as a family man, but does it matter if he's doing something personally so disgusting? The sort of myriad corruption that we can point to in the Biden family is one thing, but on a personal level, for a man who pitches so much of his personal character, I think this is absolutely disgusting. I think it's gross that so many people on the left defend it. I think you're going to hear more after Maureen Dowd kind of broke the ice there, but very, very slowly. So let me toss this open to the group.
Yeah, I just would say, yeah, obviously this is really cruel to the child. Of course, being out in public in this story, being in public is itself a kind of cruelty. It's always a balance of how much to talk about something like this. When the kid will grow up and get old enough to hear what people were saying. But it's worth noting, not only did Biden put this kind of normalcy and decency at the central part of his pitch, the American people, he's actually defending against his corruption charges with much the same thing, right? Like, I'm a good father, I'm a good grandfather, and he's using that as a shield at the same time, just excluding this little girl from the lineage and the name to which she is entitled. On a more like hard-headed sort of political note, I really wonder why the New York Times thinks it's okay to write about this story now. It does, maybe too much speculation in this, but it does make me wonder if there are more Democratic Party insiders that are open to shoving Biden aside, maybe in favor of Governor Newsom or somebody else. In terms of, because there was a total radio silence on this issue, and all the facts on this issue have been out for a very long time, and no interest in the media in terms of covering this story about the Bidens until now. So just throwing out that speculation.
Yeah, so I would say Joe Biden made this fair game because he's literally made hugging his family and the loyalty there essential to his public character. So he has brought this upon himself. And I think the reality is, and we've long known this in Joe Biden's remarks and his actions, he is, and also as now the media has reported, he's a very angry and nasty person interpersonally. This shows you the callousness of the Biden family and how politically calculating they are. You won't let this little girl take the family's name if she wants it. And then Hunter Biden, who brought in all these millions of dollars, has his child care payments reduced substantially and is going to help pay off his debts essentially in his artwork. That's the story there. Usually talking about what goes on in individuals' personal lives, including political people can be horrible in their personal lives and great leaders. But in this case, again, he has made this part of his image. So it's certainly fair game to talk about how cruel this appears to be. And I'm struck, Jonathan Turley has covered this at length. Turley is not a guy who would normally harp on this sort of thing, but you can see at a very personal level how impacted he is in witnessing this, having covered the Bidens' obfuscation on this issue for so long. And I think it's very telling when you see someone like a Turley react in the way that he has to this issue. Now, the other aspect of this, also worth noting, obviously, the Democrats obviously excuse the actions of Bill Clinton, and this goes back to Teddy Kennedy and beyond. So there's nothing new here in terms of the Biden family defenders. Now, why did the media raise this? I mean, I've been kind of a broken record on the fact that there have been myriad insurance policies waiting out there, including the open secrets known for years about the Biden family's influence peddling and corruption, any of which could be dropped on Joe Biden at any time to the extent the Democrat Party and really the ruling regime wants him out. So I view this as just one in a potential, what seems like a drip of stories that might be used ultimately to sideline Joe Biden. And there does seem to be something of an effort to start coordinating Gavin Newsom, at least if you pay attention to establishment media. So maybe this is finally the time where they are preparing the grounds for a switch, but it's yet to be seen.
So I don't buy it. I do not buy that this is kind of the final knife to get Joe Biden out of the running. I think that would happen back in January when various deep state actors unveiled Biden's own classified document retention scandal at the Chinese Communist Party funded Penn Center for Global Diplomacy, or whatever the heck it's called. And then we saw the timeline where that we saw that kind of happened right around the time of the November election is when the federal officials started getting involved there. That kind of looked like a quasi cover up of sorts. That to me was the ruling class's attempt to get Joe Biden out. But he didn't go out. I mean, his campaign formally launched in April. I mean, if you want to call it a campaign, it has fewer than 20 full-time employees. It has no physical headquarters. It looks like they're going to try to reprise the 2020 strategy of having a senile dude kind of, doddering on the brink of who knows what, run from a basement. I mean, it looks like they're trying to do that again. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is I think that their window of opportunity to try to shunt him aside has, pending unforeseen events, or at least not presently contemplatable events, has for now largely closed. I mean, again, a lot could change. I mean, Joe Biden could obviously be hospitalized tomorrow. He's in demonstrably, palpably, viscerally horrible health. So, I mean, a lot could change, but for now, I don't see it happening. And one other final thing to note. David Byler, I think his name. He's a statistician with the Washington Post, and he's quite good. I try to keep up with a lot of his analysis. And one thing that he has made a habit of noting, not just recently, kind of in the broader context of this flurry of Maureen Dowd-esque attempts to kind of seemingly nuke Joe Biden, but one thing that David Byler has been noting is that, for all the talk of kind of the movement of the white working class away from kind of being the hardscrabble party of FDR, Harry Truman Democrats towards the modern GOP, the single largest demographic constituency that currently comprises Democratic votes is actually non-college educated whites. I think it was 32%, if I'm not mistaken, of the 2020 Democratic Party national vote share was non-college educated whites. And the broader point here is that for all of kind of the leftist activists' desire to throw aside this horribly, health-ridden man who was from a different era and put in Pete Buttigieg, Kamala Harris, trying to do that while simultaneously not losing that 32% of non-college educated whites who are still stubbornly voting Democrats, while Joe Biden is the only person who is even willing to occasionally mouth the rhetoric of kind of being working class Joe from Scranton, Pennsylvania, talk about manufacturing, things like that. That's very difficult. So color me quite skeptical that they're going to be able to pull this off successfully, although I have no doubts that various kind of activists would like to do so.
All right, let's transition to final thoughts. Who wants to kick us off?
If to avoid the silence that usually takes place when we first ask this question, I'll go first because I have a very sort of self-contained thing. Last time we talked about, when we were talking about the affirmative action case, I said my greatest hope for this is that it's going to start bleeding into America's corporations and all of those clearly racially discriminatory programs that are being used in America's corporations to promote essentially Black and Hispanic and sometimes female applicants over white, male and Asian applicants, both within and initial hiring. I think most people understand. They're just not really honest with themselves about it, but most people understand that's happening. They observe it. And I was hoping that some of the rationale, even though it's under a different constitutional basis, that some of the court's reasoning about the colorblind constitution would then bleed over into, for example, Title VII stuff under the Civil Rights Act, and generally scare corporations into this idea that, in fact, they cannot discriminate on the basis of race, even if they're doing it for DEI purposes. That seems like it might be working. I have a report from Aaron Sibarium, who's still working on a larger story about this, but he's been tweeting out that he's been talking, for example, to DEI departments in large law firms, and that actually even liberal attorneys are telling large corporations, no, you have to cool it with this, like you're potentially legally liable. That would be a very, very good outcome from this case. And it's not one of those direct, you can draw a line legally, but it just, a lot of this, a lot of the doctrines, as Josh knows very well, a lot of the doctrines from equal protection and there's a lot of cross-pollination in terms of the court doctrines across these different anti-discriminatory, whether constitutional provisions or provisions under the Civil Rights Act. And it sounds like law firms, at least, and hopefully the rest of corporate America tomorrow, will actually have to start worrying about something very basic, which is they are practicing racial preferences just as universities. And that'll be a much harder nut to crack because they're much more ideologically sort of locked in and willing to sacrifice for the cause. But if we can threaten large American corporations with the potential of very expensive and unsavory lawsuits over their racial preferences in hiring, I think that would be a very positive thing. So it's good to hear that that's happening. So my white pill for today.
I'll be really brief. I would echo second Josh's recommendation about that Philip Hamburger piece on the abridging of speech. It's a hugely significant argument with respect to the Missouri v. Biden case and at least one other associated case of, you don't necessarily need to find a smoking gun of government official telling a social media company to take down an account or a tweet, even though there are myriad smoking guns that show exactly that in the evidence in Missouri v. Biden. But abridging speech and looking at how that is actually defined and understood points to any number of activities that the government has taken with respect to the social media companies, inducing those companies to do things that constrict our right to speak freely about clearly, obviously protected issues. So it's a really compelling piece, and we'll see ultimately if these arguments get fleshed out and whether or not they get up to the Supreme Court, or maybe they prevail and are sustained below the Supreme Court. That aside, I don't really have necessarily a takeaway on it, but obviously, maybe next week we'll be talking about the fact that purported whistleblower Gal Luft was indicted by the Department of Justice. Luft, of course, has come out and he gave about 14 minutes worth of testimony. He's sort of been on the run, essentially facing all of these potential charges, now charges that have been brought. But he claims that he went to the FBI and pointed towards these basically corrupt payments from Chinese entities to the Biden family. And of course, now the Biden Justice Department is seeking to prosecute him. That's obviously going to be something that we'll be watching in the days and months to come. Last but not least, worth noting that Christopher Wray, I assume by the time this episode is out, will have testified before Congress. We'll be fascinated to see what he is asked by the House Judiciary Committee. House Republicans are seeking to potentially move the next FBI headquarters to Alabama. I've seen there are related issues, of course, around Section 702 and FISA this year. So any number of interesting matters presenting themselves right now around weaponization of the national security apparatus and the national security apparatus's efforts to go after wrong thinkers through both prosecution as well as censorship. All of these issues playing out in real time, and I'm sure we'll cover some of them next week.
So we'll talk briefly also about Supreme Court and judicial nominations and all of that. So I had a piece for Newsweek last week. So I've actually, this is public by now. It's been public for a month and a half. I've switched roles in Newsweek. I no longer control the op-ed page, but I finally participated in our new daily debate. Our debate of the day was not a debate of the day when I was there. That's been an editorial change. And the debate that I participated in was basically whether or not the Supreme Court was somehow illegitimate in the aftermath of this term. And the point that I repeatedly took pains to emphasize was that the statistics belie the very notion that this past term was some sort of radically right-wing, crazy reactionary Supreme Court. And I took a peek and I saw that my good friend Ilya Shapiro, I think many of our good friends actually, Ilya Shapiro had a piece of Newsweek today making actually the exact same point. I think his piece is entitled "What Right-Wing Court?" So it's worth just kind of briefly kind of making that argument, I guess. If you look at the sheer number of 6-3 quote unquote ideological decisions, where you have the 6 Republican nominated justices in the majority and the 3 Democratic nominated justices in the dissent, I think there were 5 for the, if I'm not mistaken, for this entire Supreme Court term, whereas the previous year was closer to like 13 or 14. I can't remember the exact number, but it's something right along those lines. So there were demonstrably, I explicitly far fewer of those terms. If you look at these statistics as to which justices were in the majority most frequently this term, it was the 3 more centrist Republican nominated justices. That would be Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who found themselves in the majority most often this term, admittedly. But if you look at the 2 justices who found themselves in the majority least often, I think a lot of people would guess Sonia Sotomayor and Ketanji Brown Jackson. No, the 2 justices who were in the majority least often were the 2 actual conservatives on the court, Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas. So, I mean, that basically, I think, says all you need to know. It's worth also emphasizing there's been a couple of kind of scatter plot kind of ranking the justices ideologically from like most liberal to most conservative based on their votes. This past term, I've seen multiple of these. One that was in Axios, one that was in, I can't remember what else. It was Politico, New York Times, something like that. And both of these have Sonia Sotomayor so far out there. She is orders of magnitude more liberal than any of the conservatives are more right-wing, Samuel Alito, Clarence Thomas. And it basically just underscores, to be clear, I'm not casting aspersions on Samuel Alito, Clarence Thomas, who are 2 amazing Americans. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that this narrative that this is kind of a right-wing reactionary court is just total and complete nonsense. And, I would encourage folks who have not done so to read the final at least 10 to 15 pages of John Roberts' majority opinion in the affirmative action case, where he just kind of emphasizes over and over again that the 2 leading dissenters in that case, Justices Jackson and Sotomayor, simply do not grasp, or they do not grapple with, I should say, Justice Powell's affirmative action opinion, which came to be kind of the defining opinion of the Bakke case of 1978, which kind of got the court down this horrible rabbit hole of race-conscious admissions. I think it was Ketanji Brown Jackson literally doesn't even mention Justice Powell's opinion. She just repeatedly cites the dissenting opinions of Thurgood Marshall, William Brennan, justices like that. And Sonia Sotomayor had like one kind of passing snarky reference. So, if I'm taking kind of, the gloves off here, I guess what I really would say is that some of these progressives are just fundamentally unserious jurists. Frankly, it is never any doubt whatsoever as to where they will vote on any issue of any reasonable consequence whatsoever that pertains to the Democratic Party's very explicit cable news and New York Times driven partisan agenda. The only relevant question is whether kind of Roberts, Kavanaugh, Barrett, and occasionally Gorsuch will side properly with Alito or Thomas, depending on the case. So just want to get that off my chest.
I'm so glad you did, because I think I was trying to describe the sophistry to Inez on another podcast we did, and I really struggled without having a legal background. But you can just read it, and it feels like freshman pre-law, the work of like freshman pre-law people. It's so bad. But my final thought will be just in general on this question of like, if you're trying to run on restoring sanity to schools, restoring common sense to schools, et cetera, and you have this type of media in your way, like the Casey DeSantis ad, I was just thinking about this since we had that conversation. It makes me so sad, because I genuinely think one of the amazing things Ron DeSantis had done and Glenn Youngkin was able to do before the media quite caught on to a narrative was talk to parents directly and bring new information, to campaign on new information, and to come up with some sort of novel policies. And then the media developed a narrative and made it increasingly impossible to communicate with parents and to create policies and defend policies and to incentivize other politicians to pursue policy solutions, because the media has finally figured out a way to put a huge price on it. And that doesn't mean we don't have, brave policymakers, but it does mean that this entire campaign is just going to be, when you have people like Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump, whoever is nominated up against Biden, it's just really sad to me how little honesty the media is going to afford in this conversation. And it's just such a serious one, because it affects kids' mental health, their physical health, and it's affecting people every single day. So On that note, thanks everybody for sticking around. Thanks everybody for watching. I'm Emily Jashinsky, and on behalf of Inez, Ben, Josh, and myself, thank you so much for tuning in to NatCon Squad. We'll see you next week.